And thank you so much for joining us once again as kind of a, kind of milestone marker, I guess, in between our Institute 1 and Institute 2 to keep our good work in the advising area going. So I'm going to go ahead and mute us on this end, and you can go ahead and take over.
Great. Thanks so much, Christine. Good afternoon, everyone. This is Megan Ireland. I'm the Director of Integrated Student Support Strategies at Achieving the Dream, and I'm joined by my colleague Julia Lawton, who's the Associate Director in this area. And we're really excited to be with you all this afternoon. I know some of you are joining us from the Guided Pathways meeting, and I know you had a great morning with Hannah from CCRC, who was awesome, working on the scale of adoption. We're really looking forward to spending just a little bit of time with you this afternoon, as Christine mentioned, as kind of a bridge between the first institute that we all had together, the first Integrated Advising and Student Support Institute that we had back on October 27th, and then as a bridge to the upcoming institute that we'll have on March 2nd. The goal today really is to kind of build or, perhaps re-energize some of your energy and momentum from that October Institute on Integrated Advising and Student Support. I know, it can be really exciting to go to some of these meetings and institutes, and your team gets lots of energy, and then it's hard to go back to campus and be hit with the reality of our day-to-day lives. So we're hoping to, again, kind of build or re-energize some of the momentum that you have. We also want to provide you with some of the key kind of concepts and principles for strategy execution as you continue to engage in your design and implementation of your integrated approach, particularly focusing on kind of, moving towards your action plan and your progress tracking, which we'll be focusing on at the March 2nd Institute. And then we also want to make sure that you walk away from this webinar feeling really confident about what we're asking you to bring with you to the Institute in terms of kind of advanced work that will really make the Institute meaningful for you and your team. So I know that most of you were with us in that Institute, but just in case there's a few new folks in the room, I'm just going to spend just 2 quick slides kind of reviewing, again, what we're meaning by integrated student support and how this fits with your Guided Pathways work. So in terms of Guided Pathways, we know how important and how difficult it can be to really think about what redesign efforts are needed to make sure that we can get students on the path and keep them on the path. And an integrated student support approach for us really focuses on 4 main areas in order to get to those goals. The first is career, academic, and financial planning, really we embed that early in their students' connections with the institution. The next is advising, counseling, and coaching, moving to more proactive and holistic advising. The third is targeting risk and intervention. So, not just using early alert and raising and lowering flags, but really using evidence-based interventions to tie alerts to real-time, just-in-time support. And then finally, transfer practices and labor market alignment. So again, starting with the students' end goals in mind and making sure that they transition smoothly and successfully. The other slide that I'll share, and again, those of you who are with us are familiar with these slides, is we really like to draw from the way that CCRC talks about good kind of student support, because we know that there's not just one model. It's not like we all have to have centralized advising or faculty mentors, but a lot of what we want to make sure that we're doing is aligning the way we redesign advising and student supports into a SIP approach. So SIP standing for sustained, so moving away from kind of inoculation, but to a kind of providing those supports throughout the student experience. Strategic, knowing that we have limited resources, how do we really maximize the support to students based on the types of supports they need and the way that they need them. Integrated, so bringing together, disparate technologies, siloed departments, and disconnected student services into a more cohesive whole. Proactive, so rather than kind of waiting for students to use the services or need the services, trying to design policies and practices and communication strategies that ensure that we're providing and reaching those students with the sort of supports they need before they reach that crisis point. And then personalized, because we know that students are most likely to follow through on using supports if they're connected to them and delivered by someone that they have a relationship with. So again, hopefully that was just, all of a reminder or a refresher for you as you think about the work that we did at the Institute. So, you'll remember the Institute, we spent some time doing this kind of foundational understanding, what we know from the research, what we know from what other institutions have been doing, particularly through the IPASS grant. And then we also, at that Institute in October, spent some time with your teams going through the discovery inventory, which is a part of the toolkit that you all received for this work. Really thinking about, well, what is our current structure and current student flow look like in terms of student support. We also spent some time on readiness, really looking at assessing kind of their leadership cultures and what we need in order to be successful with this work. Because we know that this is really about, this type of work requires people to change the way we do our jobs. It's really a people and process kind of type of change, that the communication piece and the stakeholder piece is really important. So we spent some time there, and then we also spent some time at the end thinking about initial action plans and progress tracking and next steps for you all that you all identified between that institute and the next one. So as I mentioned today, we want to spend a little bit of time sharing some of what we've learned as we've supported institutions on this around what good strategy execution looks like. And so the next we've got a few slides that are about lessons learned. These are things that we've collected from colleges we've worked with, things that they wish they had known and when they were looking back at the work they've done. So we kind of share them with you now. And then, that these really have relate to 5 specific strategy execution principles that we wanted to share with you. And, maybe as we're going through them, you can just kind of have a mental checklist of, what you feel like your institution is doing well, or which ones of these you may want to be focusing on in the lead up to our next time together on March 2nd and beyond. So this slide just shares a few of the overall kind of lessons learned that some of our colleges have shared with us. And, for many of these, it does emphasize the way in which this work is about change management. And the importance of being really intentional as we design how we're going to roll out and implement this type of redesign effort. So things like, building the guiding team, making sure that it's cross-functional and cross-hierarchical, recognizing that there's lots of student success initiatives probably going on campus, and how do we really bridge those and bring those together. Also the importance of being intentional about celebrating the early wins. So, I think that, going out of the Institute last October, I hope that completing that discovery inventory, that was an early win, and, you were able to take some next steps from that and share that more broadly. And then, also needing to think about kind of the role of student data and what all we need to really inform the design, rather than just trying to fix some of the leaky gaps, but doing it in a more intentional and holistic way. So our first principle is really around visioning. And we know that this is important both from literature on change leadership, but also from what our colleges have told us about the importance for really trying to make transformative change that doesn't just kind of tweak some adjustments around the margins, but is truly going to impact the student experience. That really requires changes to structure, process, and attitude. And having a really strong vision that all stakeholders can understand is important, so that people aren't worried about, oh, how is this going to affect my job? How am I going to be impacted by this? But really understand kind of the why and the what we're driving towards, what's that desired future state. So when we think about having a strong vision statement, some of the things that we talk about are, the importance of, really aligning this vision with the institution's strategic plans. Again, so it doesn't feel like just yet another initiative we're doing, but it feels like a cohesive whole in the direction of the institution. Making sure that vision statements address questions like why now, and what will look differently. And then finally, that it's something that all stakeholders are able to explain and see themselves in that vision. Some of our institutions have shared that there's a lot of work around buy-in that's important as when we think about how to create understanding about the types of changes we need to make to advising and student support, and how that's really going to impact an individual's daily work. and their students, and that requires intentional communication. They've also, told us about that they wish they hadn't just waited to know all the answers before they started communicating their vision. So that some have said, it's okay to say, I don't know yet, but we want to bring you in as a part of this process early on. Again, so that the communication of that vision is really happening frequently and clearly across all the stakeholders. A second principle is really about the student experience and the importance of, situating any of our redesign efforts in this area around the student experience from the student's perspective. And we share this quote. If any of you have heard our president, Dr. Stout, speak, she sometimes shares this story where she had this group of students and she was sharing their retention data and, being very transparent about the data. And the student said, it's great to see these numbers and charts, but Dr. Stout, for me, retention is tomorrow. And I think that just really, hit home for the ways in which we need to make sure that we're bringing the students into the center of how we're thinking about the design from their perspective and their experience. One quick example of this, we have an institution, and you all did a kind of a shortened process mapping activity with us in October. This institution did one that was a more in-depth process map from admission all the way to read through testing, registration, and getting into their first advising session. And they actually had the students do this. So, that's one thing I encourage you all to think about. And I know some of you were excited to take that process mapping activity back to your campus. And if you haven't, you might consider, facilitating your own process mapping experience using the activity that we did with you. They facilitated this with a group of students. And, one thing that stood out from this, and, it's hard to read here, but the students, they realized that there was this common Post-it note that they saw popping up throughout the process map that the students had created for this, created for them. And this is what it said. It said, take a ticket and wait. And it was, again, it was placed, at least 5 different points in the students' process and their experience. And so, for that institution, for them, if they had done their redesign just with staff, and staff, they absolutely have insights into where, some of the main important gaps are. But if they really had done this without the student perspective, it's possible they could have missed some of the changes that they would have needed to make to really address this perception problem around, what we are asked to do at every step in our process is to take a ticket and wait. So when we think about, getting to know your students as a part of your kind of design and execution of your advising and student support work, these are some of the questions we like to remind folks to ask. Thinking about, who are your students, where they come from, what are their goals, not just the demographics, but also to think about, what do they think they need as supports, and what do they think, how do they think about using your services, and then how do they actually use them? Because sometimes there can be a gap there. So we just raise these as some of the questions you may consider, really trying to delve into at this point in your redesign efforts. So principle 3 is really, it gets back to this idea of creating that unified team. And our chapter 2 of our toolkit, as you all know, is entirely focused on creating that guiding team for this work. And so we bring this principle up again because we know that it really does matter who is at the table and what you do to engage stakeholders, which is what we try to work through in that chapter 2 of the toolkit. So I know some of you all were discussing at the end of our day together in October, oh, I wish I had brought so-and-so to this institute, or, now that you have a better sense of the scope of the work, really checking back in and maybe revisiting chapter 2 to really think about, well, who do we need at the table? What is the best structure for executing on these redesign efforts? This is just one quote from, one of the kind of change leadership books that's out there, but, this idea that the traditional structures, they may meet daily demands, but they're really not built for this constant kind of change, turbulence, and disruption that has become the new normal in many ways. And so the question is, how do we think in an innovative way about breaking down traditional structures of how we've gotten work done and creating ones that are really going to accelerate the type of redesign that you're trying to create. And some of that is this idea of moving beyond buy-in. And I think we discussed this slide briefly back in October, so I won't spend too much time, but it is good to remember that, buy-in isn't just a passive acceptance, or a lack of resistance. How do we really move to getting people to feel like they're co-owners of this process, that they are empowered to give input to this process, and that things aren't just being done to them. So I wanted to share just 2 examples from our colleges of ways that they've structured their teams, as it might give you some thoughts on how you will structure your team, or you may have already created a structure after October. I know you all have your guided pathways team, so there may be ways that you're going to either infuse that with this team or do a sub working group on this topic. So one example is from the Community College of Philadelphia. And they have an overarching student success team. They call it the Student Success 2.0 team. And they created this team to really be, in some ways, the overarching kind of lead across multiple initiatives. So, their integrated student support lead is on this team, their guided pathways, they're achieving the dream. So all the different initiatives to really make sure that there was coordinated effort across them and they weren't just standalone initiatives operating on their own. And then below that, they have the project or strategic action teams. And these are teams that are focused on moving the work forward on one of those specific initiatives. And then finally, they have working groups that are a subset of those action teams that are really directed by those project teams, and are working groups that can bring together faculty, staff, and administrators to collaborate, to do that kind of inform and give input on the implementation of policy changes and things that they'll be needing to do as a result of those changes that are made. One other example is from Queensborough, and so they took the approach of having a leadership team which included, mostly hierarchically, mostly middle and senior managers, but a little bit more kind of cross-functional people, and really charged them with being responsible for the vision, the guidance, the reporting of progress, and then with underneath that team were a set of working groups that were really focused on the implementation. And this was a larger group. So they kept that leadership team, which we recommend doing, kept that leadership team smaller, and then was really able to garner more broader engagement through the use of working groups. So I'm going to turn it over to Julia, who's going to take us through a few more of these.
Great. So principle number 4 is essentially about how can we create an environment, so policies, processes, structures, in which the behaviors that we want to see actually occur and become the norm. And so there's a couple of ways that we can do this. And it's important because the execution of any strategy, any work plan is dependent upon individual behaviors. If the changes how, for example, advisors work with other student support staff to deliver the right services at the right time to students, the actual daily execution of that is very heavily reliant upon individuals following behaviors that we intend for them to follow. And so this approach kind of looks at the holistic environment in which we operate as people, and looks at the different motivations and abilities of the people we're asking to change to actually make that change. And so it's really critical for the execution of your strategy. And so one of the ways, the tools or the frameworks that we use with some colleges that has proved really helpful in this particular part of strategy execution is Fogg's behavior model. You may have seen this before, but essentially the theory goes that an individual's behavior is equivalent to the motivation, their ability, and I would include our belief of our ability as well in that. and then the triggers that kind of remind us and prompt us to take these behaviors that we want to follow. And so this is the model in a bit more detail. And so when you're kind of thinking about the changes in behavior you want to see, this kind of structure helps you to set up an environment in which the behaviors become the norm, they become easier, they become more routine. So the first thing we have on the left-hand side is the kind of motivation. So in order to be able to do a behavior, we want the motivation to be somewhat high. So core motivators, for example, could be whether it's fun, whether you can get pleasure from it, whether it's a painful process to follow, whether you have hope that that's going to have an impact on your students or you fear it could have a negative impact, and then acceptance or rejection of the actual process and the path forward itself. On the bottom, you have the ability, and so obviously the higher the ability to do this new behavior, to follow this new process, the more likely it is that that is going to take place. But I'd also include in this our belief in our ability. So we've all heard people who say, well, I'm not good at math, so I can't use data. Or I don't understand this data and I'm not going to be able to because I was terrible at math at school. Well, that is not an inherent ability. We all have the ability to understand data. And so making sure you understand not only whether they actually have the ability, but also whether they have how they believe in their own ability to do it is really important and can help you kind of design your training and professional development and ongoing support around those pieces. And then number 3, up the top near the star, is behavior triggers. So this is, examples would be reminders of you have to do this at this time. It really helps, especially on our day-to-day busy lives, to have those reminders in place, something to spark our memory and, oh, we have to do that today. Another behavior trigger, for example, specifically to this work, could be sending out an automated report of kind of flags raised on an advisor's caseload of students, and that would trigger their behavior to follow up on some of those things. But having it automated kind of helps make it easier for them to remember to do that. And so once you've looked at those pieces, it's not always, just because you have the motivation and the ability and you get a reminder doesn't mean it's always going to happen. And there are a couple of reasons for that. So once you've looked through all of those, you've asked those questions, are they motivated? Do they have the ability? Do they believe in their own ability? And have we reminded them? You can look at simplicity factors. So you'll see that on the screen as well. So do they have the time to do it? A lot of the time, unfortunately, that can be no. So how do we work around that? How do we make it less time consuming? What else do we reprioritize to give them the time to do this? Is there money involved that isn't available? Or do we need to use money to kind of help it become easier? Is it a lot of effort? So for example, just because I know I have the motivation and the ability to email my caseload of 600 students, doesn't mean I have the ability to do it. It doesn't mean I can do it because of time and because of the effort involved in doing that and making those emails personal. So it's really important to think of those things. And then there's a couple of other simplicity factors, such as, is it routine? Is it something that they can just not even think about and just get done? And if not, how do we make it that way so it becomes easier and more part of their daily work? And the other one is it the norm? Is it expected of them? And do they know that others are doing it? So to what extent can you use social pressure, for lack of a better word, to encourage the behaviors you want to see? So that would be saying, using faculty, for example, as to help train other faculty in how to use an early alert system. Having that peer-to-peer connection helps to show that this is part of the faculty role and it is something that is important for faculty to consider. So principle number 5 is to monitor the work, how you're progressing in the work, so implementation, but also the impact that your efforts are having from the beginning. So this requires you to have a plan in place before anything gets started. but also to start using that data early on and not wait till the end of the first semester, for example, to start figuring out what impact your work is having on your students. And a couple of these next slides we went through back in October, but it was October and it's February now, so we're kind of recapping a couple of them as well again. So the first is, how do we actually do progress tracking? And this goes back to chapter 8 in the toolkit that we shared with you back in October. So the first step, it kind of works backwards, as you might expect. The first step is to identify what you're intending to do to achieve with the changes that you want to make. And ideally, that is something that the institution's design team or lead team or whatever you want to call it is working on themselves. So they know what changes in behavior they need to see, they know what changes in student outcomes they want to see, and they know kind of how they want the structures and the attitudes to change as well. So that team really kind of puts together their ideal for what they want to achieve. The next step is to actually make this into something we can measure, and that is where the design team will want to work with people with more specific skills in kind of data and technology. So that would be your IR and IT department, most likely, but if you're an ATD college, that may be your data team as well. If you have a small IR shop and you're not in ATD, consider bringing in some of your math faculty as well. They're always really good at kind of thinking through these things. The next step is to then develop a data collection plan. So not only what data you want to collect it, but how frequently, which department is going to be responsible for collecting that data, and what's going to happen to it to then make it into something that is used by your team to change your implementation effort as needed. And then final step is to actually use the data that you have to inform your improvements and modifications. So that is to your model of your new student support and advising model, but it's also to how you implement. For example, you will want to track the impact of your communication efforts and how many people are seeing those and opening the emails, for example, so you can kind of track and see how you need to change that approach as well. And so that leads us into the types of data that we encourage you to collect for this kind of redesign work. So again, this maps back to chapter 8, where we lay out these 5 different categories of measures that we encourage you to collect and to use as you're working through this. So we encourage you to not just focus on one category. A lot of the time, you'll see measures in student success. Most of these tend to be kind of somewhat lagging, so that they don't tell you anything you can act on immediately. And you often see technology use measures. So how many flags have been raised, how many faculty are logging into the system, how many students have a plan in place. But really to really know what's going on and the impact your work is having and how effective it's being, having measures in all 5 of those categories is really important. And chapter 8 does list a whole host of examples that for each of those categories to help you get started. And so this is essentially what this ends up looking like. So the focus is really on intermediary and initial outcomes so that you can make those changes as you go through and be nimble in your implementation approach. So, for example, I'll go back to the communications piece. So, as I said, a lot of colleges will track their technology uptake. So if they're implementing, for example, this new early alert system, they will track how many flags are raised, how many kudos are sent out, how many faculty use the system. But it doesn't necessarily tell you why people aren't using it. Just having that uptake data isn't the whole story. And so for that, you'll need some qualitative data. So you'll need to ask people, figure out through focus groups, interviews, other approaches to figure out why this new system isn't working and isn't being used. But you could also use, for example, the impact of your communication efforts. So, and the feedback that you get from your training sessions as well. So from that gives you a fuller picture of why the intended change in behavior that you had at the beginning isn't actually occurring. And so there are a couple of questions that we encourage you to think through when you're preparing to use data for this kind of work. I'm not really going to go through all of them, but I do want to highlight a couple of the impact of these pieces. So the first is data can strengthen the communication and buy-in for the change. So not everyone is swayed by anecdotes, and we shouldn't necessarily be in most instances. And some people just have a more analytical mind and want to know the data behind decisions and why we're changing the way we work with students. The second is that data can empower leaders across the college, not just at the top of the college hierarchy. And it can promote collaboration and understanding across silos. So if we're working with the same data, it can give us a basic common understanding of what issues exist, where we are at the moment, and that can kind of be the foundation on which we can truly collaborate because we have that common baseline. And then data can help find the intersections in student success efforts that we know we need to align to help us realize the goal of this integrated model. So what's next for this group? So this is kind of a bit of a timeline of where we've been, more than what's next. So you'll see there was a process mapping webinar that you had after our first institute in October. The second thing we did is today. It's this action planning and progress tracking kind of presentation via Zoom. The next stage is we're going to be coming together in person for the second Redesign, Advising and Student Support Redesign Institute at Middlesex County College, and that's on the 2nd of March. And then after that, there is another Zoom webinar, another opportunity to continue learning. As we know, as we've said before, one institute or two institutes is certainly not enough to get this work off the ground. And so that's going to be focused on overcoming challenges and next steps for this change. And then the final next step is another career conference, and again at Middlesex County College. So specifically for our next institute in March, given that that is coming up very soon, it's almost a month away tomorrow, we wanted to share a kind of high-level view of what we're going to do to help you prepare. The first thing we're looking at is our outcome goals, our learning outcome goals for this institute, for our time together, for our one day. The first is we want to focus on refining the vision and goals for this work within the context of your guided pathways work. And hopefully you've been thinking about this and working on this since October, even though it's been busy, and so we can kind of come together around that again. The next step is to begin to develop a communication strategy that includes the alignment of the colleges of your student support redesign work, but also your pathways work. So the communication piece, as we've said, is critical to this. Beyond just having a vision and talking about your vision, the other communication efforts are incredibly important. So we want to get that done, started up front. The next is to develop a strong start to an actual action plan for getting this work started and reaching those visions and goals that you have set. And finally, knowing where and how to access additional tools, resources, and coaching is going to be another outcome for us, because while we can do these kind of one-off webinars and institutes, we know that on a daily basis your needs will change. Working with the IPAS colleges, they will, from the grant, they will submit work to us and reports to us, and then a month later their needs have completely changed because something in their environment or at their college has changed, and so their needs have changed. So making sure that you have access to the support you need when you need it is really important. And then, so the specific topics we're going to focus on for this session are analysis of our progress and challenges. So far you'll have done some pieces of work, you'll recognize there are gaps that you need to focus on, and so what we want to do is take a bit of time to reflect on what's happened since our last institute together, and kind of process some of that work. And hopefully what we can do with that is help kind of reframe some of the rest of the day so that we can make sure to address those in the action planning. There's going to be a couple of breakout sessions to cover more specific topics. One example is design thinking. This is a process for problem solving, particularly big, messy problems. that we've been using with other colleges, with our IPAS grantees, since the beginning of their work, and so we wanted to make sure that we provided a comprehensive overview of that as well. Second is behavioral change, so focusing on how we can leverage professional development and HR tools to address the behavioral changes that we want to see. And so an example of that, there's a book written by ASNU, and they have examples in there. It's about becoming a student-ready institution. And one of the examples they have in there is that staff actually had it in their job description that they had to work across silos to deliver certain supports to students. So they could then be held accountable in their reviews, in their promotion kind of opportunities for actually collaborating with other departments. Another example of a topic we're going to cover is the engagement of faculty in student support redesign. This has been a common question that we've had across every single state we've worked with. No matter what current role the faculty have in student support, the question always comes up. So we wanted to make sure we address that as well in more detail. The last two are strategy execution and developing your action plan, as we've talked about, and then using data to inform the refinement of your work. So we're going to go into more detail and work together on those topics specifically, which is why we wanted to talk to you today about those. Okay, so there's a couple of pieces of homework to complete before March 2nd, and I know Christine may have already sent some information out about these pieces, and we talked about some of them at the last institute as well, so hopefully this is not news to you and you saw this at the last convening. The first is the last two columns of the discovery inventory, so that we have some kind of idea of where you would like to go, and we can work on creating an action plan based on that. Second is the advising rubric, for CCRC's advising rubric that was shared again at the last institute. And then finally is the process map based on your training that you got through the webinar after the institute. Each college was asked to complete a process map. So here's what we want you to bring, all of that essentially. So the discovery inventory with the last two columns completed, your completed advising rubric, your process map, and if you have completed it and you want to bring it, your CCRC scale of adoption for pathways self-assessment. We also want you to bring your draft vision and goals for your student support redesign that we developed at the first institute and hopefully you've been refining over the last few months. If not, you can bring it and we can refine it together there. So I'm going to pause at this point and see if we have any questions. Nothing's come through on the chat so far, but I wanted to see if we have any questions now.
Thanks so much, Mayan and Julia. I will pause to see if anyone in this group has any questions. I don't think the other folks will be able to do it via audio, but you can certainly use the chat. So those of you who are joining us electronically, please feel free to use the chat function if you have a question. Does anyone here have any questions for Mayan or Julia? Yes.
I don't recall the advising rubric. I was there in October. I don't recall what that looks like.
So they're asking what the advising rubric looks like. Do you want to describe that? I don't know if you have an image that you could show. I don't have mine.
Yeah. So this was the
it's in the
CCR.
book, right? They have their books with them, so right? Isn't it in
No,
there?
it's not.
Or no?
It's not. Hello. Oh yeah, it's not in the toolkit. This was the CCRC advising rubric. We used it as a discussion tool during the institute. We didn't actually have you all fill it out. We just had you look at kind of, they have the continuum from kind of emerging through developed, kind of looking at where you might place yourself. And so what we're going to send around, and this will come, we'll send it to Christine and then she can send it out to you all, is both the kind of paper copy that you could print and then use to kind of fill out where you think your institution is in terms of that rubric. It's not very long, so I know you all have been spending a lot of time on the scale of adoption. It's not as long as that. But we also have an electronic version that you could use where, and we'll send kind of the details about how to do this, but where you could have several individuals submit where they think the institution is. or you could have a bunch of people submit, and then we can compile that into an aggregated report for you, so you can see on average, you know, kind of where different stakeholders think you are along that rubric. So we'll send that information out to Christine. But yeah, so the short answer is, I think you saw it and we talked about it, but you didn't receive, you know, detailed instructions on that yet.
Okay, so we'll follow up and we'll get that. Thank you so much, Mayan. Anyone else have any other questions? Yes, Shay.
I have a question on process mapping. I had a colleague who actually attended the webinar and I was able to make it, but what was the assignment for the process mapping?
So the question, Mayan, she's asking about the assignment for the process map. Is there something in particular that you're looking for? Sabrina Matthews had done the training for us, and we do have that online for those of you who didn't get to go to it live. The recording is there, and she was basically talking about how you can take different elements and use process mapping. So we started that process a little bit back in October, and then Sabrina took us a little bit on a deeper dive. So Mayan, is there anything specific that they should be focused on regarding the process map in terms of being ready for the March event?
Yeah, you know, maybe we probably should have put optional next to this one. It really was, and I guess I was thinking maybe from that webinar that more folks were doing it than did, but yeah, would be to bring, if your institution did those and chose to complete a process map to do that, would be to bring whatever you've done with you so we can continue to build on that. But we'll stick optional next to that one in terms of the homework.
So I think the intent really is these documents, you know, get you thinking so that you can be productive at the meeting, so you don't have to kind of start the conversation on March 2nd and use time while we're together with our national partners, but instead you've kind of done a little bit of that work so you're ready to, you know, the conversations and the table work that they'll have you do, I think will be more meaningful then. The scale of adoption will hopefully be done so that most of them should be able to bring that, although a couple of them may not be able to make that deadline. But if they have that done, that would be great to have as well. Other questions?
I see that there's a question in the Q&A section. It says, not all team members were able to participate in Institute number 1. What would you recommend to bring them on board?
That's a great question. You know, one thing, and I was actually thinking to say this even before we got that question, is it would be a great idea to bring your team together to have a meeting before to go over some of these different pieces. You know, even just to complete the inventory, you know, will probably require at least one meeting of that. But so everyone's kind of on the same page. So, you know, one thing I would recommend was, you know, sharing all of the material and activities and worksheets that you all did as a group at that first institute. The other would be to share the toolkit, and we'll send the electronic version out again so that you can share that to any other new members that you might have.
And specifically, they won't be able to read the whole toolkit. We're aware of that. But Chapter 1 will give them a good orientation to the content because we won't be recapping that. So making sure that they've read Chapter 1 will be essential so they know what we're talking about and we're all on the same page.
And I should mention that the all of the handouts, including the toolkit and your video, are online on our website. So if you go to njstudentsuccess.com and then you go to resources and then you go to advising and career, you'll see it's actually right on the top. So you can access all of those if there's someone on your campus. You know, some of you may have somebody new on campus that you want to bring in to the conversation, and that's fine too. So feel free to do that. Other questions?
One thing I wanted to just put out there was, you know, if you all, now that you've kind of seen particularly the last several slides on what we're planning for the Institute, if you have feedback or ideas, something either you're really excited or you didn't see something that you would like to focus on, you know, feel free to either put that in the chat box or voice it right now or send us an email.
Okay. Any other questions or feedback on the March 2nd? Well, I think they're looking a little overwhelmed. We just had, you know, the whole morning on the scale of adoption, and now this. So it's a lot going on this semester. A lot of work. So you know, the goal really is not to stretch you too thin. I know there's a couple, but I think you can do these kind of in tandem. I think they're very much related. And as you complete the discovery, inventory, and advising components, that's going to help you answer the helping students get on a path and stay on a path questions in the scale of adoption. So it's not really, they look like separate and they are technically separate pieces of paper, but I think the processes are very integrated. So you don't really want to do them in two separate stages. You probably want to send them out collaboratively to the right folks to answer those questions and to help guide you. And, you know, we're not collecting the discovery inventory or the advising rubric. Those are really for you and your benefit, but having, you know, doing them prior to the meeting, I think will really help you get the most out of that day. Whereas the scale of adoption, obviously, we are going to be following up specifically with you. And if you are able to share your advising and discovery inventory materials with us, we will incorporate that into our follow-up calls so that we can kind of do a deeper dive and really better understand what you need so we can best develop a new strategic plan for the coming years. All right. Well, if there are no other questions, I would just like to thank Megan and Julia once again for a fabulous webinar. You really, we'll clap for you. I don't know, can you hear us? You don't usually get that on a webinar, so that
I feel very special. Yeah.
that might be the first time I heard clapping at a webinar. They just did it without me, and so there was no instruction on my part. They did. So, and thanks to everyone who joined the call. And if you do have colleagues who are not able to be on the call, please let them know we will be posting this. You know, within a few days or so, it'll be online by next week, I'm sure, so they can go ahead and access this. And you may want to bring it back to your campus and talk to your you know, advising people, your kind of leadership teams there, and share with them the information from this webinar. So I will say thank you so much to everyone, and we will look forward to seeing you on March 2nd. I will tell you that our registration is not quite as high as we want it to be, so we think that some of you just didn't do that yet. We know everyone waits to the last minute, but the sooner that you do it, it does help us with the food count and all. So if you can, please try to get your entire teams registered sooner versus later. What would you say, Donna? About like 2 weeks ahead of time at least is helpful? At least a week ahead of time, because then we have to get our food order in. So if you can do that for us, that would be most appreciated. And we look forward to seeing you all on the 2nd, if not before.